In this session today, Nick and I will explain how the independent service heuristics work and why you might want to try them. And this is specifically to help find good boundaries for fast flow. So my name is Matthew Skelton. I'm founder at Conflux, and I'm the co-author of the book Team Topologies.
I'm Nick Tune. I'm a consultant working in the DDD Team Topology space. I'm working on a book, but let's not talk about deadlines.
So the talk today will look roughly like this. I'll explore what the independent service heuristics are and what they do. And I'm actually going to reverse engineer, we'll do a bit of reverse engineering to explain that. Nick will then explore some experience that he's had with independent service heuristics. I will do so too. And then we'll look at some takeaway points. So first of all, what are the independent service heuristics? What do they do? Let's have a look. Let's read out the official definition. The independent service heuristics are rules of thumb or clues for identifying candidate value streams and domain boundaries by seeing if they could be run as a separate SaaS or cloud product. A bit of a mouthful, but quite descriptive. If you go to teamtopologies.com/ISH, you'll find some kind of more details there. So all fine, and we're going to dive into these details in a little bit. But that gives you a picture, that sets the context. Now, we've used these independent service heuristics actually since about 2018, even just before the Team Topologies book was published. So Manuel, my co-author, and I were writing this in 2018. We started using these kind of ideas back then. The book was published in 2019. And we've evolved these since then through working with many different organizations around the world, helping them to improve how their teams work and adopt Team Topologies, but thinking about the kind of team dynamics and better flow in the organization and so on. We actually had some really, really useful input, I think at the beginning of 2020, from quite a few members of the DDD community, including Rebecca Worsbrock. This was with London DDD, wasn't it?
Virtual DDD.
Virtual DDD,
think, yeah.
Virtual DDD.
Possibly
yeah.
One of the two.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was virtual DDD. And that was super useful. So these heuristics are sort of informed by DDD, but they're taking a slightly different approach, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. There's some principles behind these. First principle is to find flow-friendly boundaries. Now that we're working in a cloud-native era, or we can work in a cloud-native way, we can have fast flow of change through the organization where we're deploying multiple times an hour, multiple times a day at the very least. So we believe, as a first principle, that we need to be looking at boundaries that enable fast flow. And I would go so far as to say this: good boundaries in 2022 are optimized for fast flow. Not absolutely everywhere. There are definitely situations where fast flow is less relevant. But by and large, in many, many organizations around the world, I think this is fair to say it's true. And how about this? DDD was not originally designed explicitly to work well with fast flow, because it's pre-cloud. How could it be? It was looking to solve a different set of problems. So independent service heuristics is trying to come from this fast flow perspective and explore boundaries from a slightly different point in time, I guess. Oops. The second principle is that we wanted to find a kind of business-friendly language to use when talking about boundaries for teams and systems and so on. Because if we're going to be super honest, let's be super honest, some DDD terminology and approaches can be a bit baffling and inaccessible for many people, if you're going to be super honest. So we need something that's a bit more kind of business-friendly, a bit more perhaps intuitive. The third principle is that we wanted to promote group discussion and learning. Because if we're going to make some big changes in an organization towards fast flow, towards the team boundaries, towards the system boundary, and so on, it's it needs some degree of consensus. It needs some degree of shared awareness within multiple groups in the organization. So we need a technique that lends itself well to this kind of group discussion and learning. And so what we've found through using these techniques is that we see this kind of coherence in concepts and terminology emerging through these group sessions. And that's partly because they've got a shared experience. If you look back to the keynote from yesterday, first thing in the morning, a huge shared experience right here in this hall, that's a very memorable thing. It means you can go away and talk about it later. It feels very, very physical. There's literally people walking around the hall with a microphone in the case of the keynote. In the case of the sessions that we've been running, it's a shared experience around the digital whiteboard. But the point there is that there's something there to provide coherence. It's a point-in-time coherence for a group of people. And the fourth principle is that we're looking for a situation where rapid results are needed. We want to be able to get quite quickly to a sense of where good boundaries might be, rather than spending weeks and weeks and weeks. And what I've come to realize myself is that independent service heuristics is a rapid, low-fidelity approach for fast flow boundaries that can benefit from using DDD alongside it, and so on. And low fidelity because it doesn't really dive into all the details, but it gets some conversations going quite quickly, which can itself be really useful. So here's the full list. I do not expect you to memorize these right now. There's 10 different heuristics, and they're all on GitHub, so it's all Creative Commons share alike. I'll go through these now, in little groups. But here's the first. The starting point is a kind of sense check. So let's think about something that we're doing, a process, a workflow, user journey, something, whatever it is. Let's say it's preparing data sets for machine learning. Right, so let's take this thing. Could it make any logical sense to offer this thing as a service? Preparing data sets for machine learning. Don't know. Is it independent enough? Would customers understand it? Would it simplify some execution? And so on. Okay, maybe. Let's explore this a bit more. The second heuristic is this, around brand. Could you imagine this thing being branded as a public cloud service? So let's say there's a website called avocadoonline.com. And it's got a nice little icon there of an avocado, and they provide data set preparation for machine learning as a service. Would it be a viable business model? Would it be a kind of compelling offering, and so on? Starting to think about it in these terms. So let's have a look at some examples of what I mean by a kind of cloud service. There's a whole bunch of them here. Clothes cleaned and laundered as a service. It exists. Certainly exists in the UK. Buying a car as a service, delivered to your door with the keys, with 14 days money-back guarantee. It now exists as a service. Running your small business as a service. All the tools you need for accounting, reporting, filing, payroll, all of this stuff as a service now exists. Trying on clothes digitally as a service, that exists. Identification, ID checks for passports and airlines as a service, that exists. Transcription of video and audio as a service, that exists. Booking a vaccine as a service, it certainly exists in the UK. Monitoring of public infrastructure endpoints as a service, and so on and so on, money transfer as a service. The point here is there's lots of quite niche things that operate literally as a service right now that you can go and buy. You can go and use. These are viable models. I mean, assuming they're not VC funded, which we know that VC funding is basically not a viable business model. Ignore that. For other things, these are viable businesses. And there's a lot that goes into viability as a business, but we'll touch on that in a little bit later. So there's a few other dimensions, things about revenue and customers. Like, does it feel like it could be managed in terms of revenue and viable customers? Can we track the costs on this thing? Is it possible to clearly define the data that would go into this service? If we can't define the inputs, it's pretty hard to offer that as a service. We're thinking about user personas. Can you identify the different user personas? whose needs would be met by this service? Does it feel like a team or a set of teams could actually effectively work on this thing and actually produce it and make that service operate? What about dependencies? Are there too many dependencies to make this thing independent and viable? Or could you see a way to removing or reducing those dependencies so this thing could be independent? And finally, what about the kind of impact and value, the kind of scope of this thing? If you're talking about something that's too small, then it's not ambitious enough. If the thing's too big, it's going to be difficult to keep coherent. And finally, around the decision around product, basically, would the team working on this thing be able to actually kind of own this as an independent product? So anyway, a bunch of things, different dimensions that we're looking at when we're thinking about possibly treating something as a separate, to give it separate boundaries for flow, as aligning teams to that thing, effectively. So in the case that I mentioned before, this is like data set preparation for machine learning. We're applying all of these heuristics against this candidate separate stream. Okay, all very well. But you want to say, probably you're saying to me, that's great, Matthew, what actually is going on here? These are all very interesting questions, but what's really going on? And to be honest, I asked myself the same question a few weeks ago. What's actually happening here? Why are these questions actually useful to help teams think about boundaries for flow? So let's do a bit of reverse engineering and have a look. The first thing is around viability. They're really exploring how viable this thing is as an independent set of processes or things or stuff that happened. Because we're thinking about dimensions like customers, we're thinking about dimensions like cost, we're thinking about dimensions like dependencies and so on. And these all indicate in one direction or another, is this thing actually viable as something independent? We're also looking at just in the marketplace. We're going out to the marketplace and seeing what the latest innovation is around as a service. I mean, the idea of clothes laundering and cleaning as a service, to me, when I first saw it, I thought, wow, that's kind of pretty niche, but it makes sense. If it's viable in the marketplace, why not? So we're using marketplace data to help us kind of challenge our ideas about what could be possible as a viable service. And clearly, if something out there is offered as a SaaS service, and if we're doing the same thing internally, then that's a really good indication that this thing could be independent, because literally a competitor or someone else is offering that thing in the cloud as a service already. So almost by definition, we could do exactly the same thing internally. We might not brand it as an external separate website, but we could certainly expect to run this internally as a separate stream or separate initiative internally. We're thinking about coupling. We're thinking about how coupled these things are. How well-defined is the data? If the data is difficult to define and needs lots of interactions with other services, maybe that's tricky. If it's quite clearly easy to define the input data, then it gives a sense that it's somewhat decoupled from other things, and so on. We start to think about, well, could we outsource this thing if it's actually already a SaaS cloud service, or we feel like it might be feasible to do that? Well, then why are we building it ourselves? Let's use some Wardley mapping intuition that Susanna was talking about yesterday, and think, well, maybe we don't even need to build that ourselves. Let's save us the bother, and let's just consume this thing from outside. We're also using business expertise. We're getting business people, and we'll have a look in a minute and see what this looks like. We're using business expertise in the sessions where we're discussing independent service heuristics to inform the discussion about viability. For those of you who are aware of the company Hire in China, then it gives some hints towards the micro-enterprise approach that Hire use as a way to scale hugely. And a similar kind of approach happens at Amazon, AWS, and places like this. Because we effectively start to think about viability of micro-enterprises effectively with this approach. We don't use the terms explicitly, but it's pointing in that direction. So, Nick will give a bit of an experience report in a second. ISH, Independent Service Heuristics, use intuition and experience from domain experts and engineers to explore viable services. That's what I think is happening with this list of 10 questions.
All right, so just a quick thing to say firstly. Anyone who knows me knows I like Miro, and this isn't a presentation in Miro, but I did create content in Miro and copy it across into here. So just anyone who doesn't get that, you're the lucky ones. So this case study I'm going to talk about applying ISH is, as we can see here, it's a North American e-commerce company working in an industry connected to health. There were some regulatory issues. And at first, when the company from that industry contacted me, didn't really see a lot of complexity there, but then they talked about ambitious growth, and I'll get to that shortly about why it actually became more interesting. So for me, I was thinking about 4 things when I decided to bring SSH into the toolbox and apply it in this situation. The first one is about validating and refining, which is slightly different to what Matthew was talking about. It's where you've done some workshops, you've identified candidate boundaries for your more domain focused, and you're wondering, can we organize teams around these things? Are they good team boundaries, or do we need to refine them further? Second point up here, as Matthew talked about, is business friendly. I'm not saying domain-driven design has some complex terminology that people find difficult, but domain-driven design has some complex terminology that some people find difficult, and it's not business friendly. Those two were different, they were different statements. So, I just want to get people thinking about boundaries in design and teams, a mixed group of people, and not have to throw too much terminology at them sometimes. Point 3 is really, we want to get away from this, we talk about this a lot, about going away from this idea of big reorgs. You hire some consultants, they do some workshops, they map out all your domains and value streams, you do a big reorg. We're trying to get to an approach where people can think for themselves, and not just 1 or 2 people, but throughout the company. So getting people involved in ISH makes these principles part of everyone's day-to-day thinking, and they can think more about design themselves, identify when boundaries aren't working and how to evolve them. Point 4, I found is quite useful sometimes to actually start with ISH, not go into Team Topologies in theory, just start with ISH. And as you go through these heuristics, you get opportunities to explain, well, to answer the question around dependencies, we can talk about different team interactions and how that has an impact on cognitive load. So it's a good opportunity to bring the concepts in from Team Topologies as you're applying them to a real situation. So when I talk about validate and refine, this is kind of what I have in mind. You might have done a workshop already, identified some boundaries, and you're like, can we go straight from this to let's build it next week and reorganize our teams, or do we need to get some more confidence first? And so from a process perspective, it's working in a way like this. I don't want to go through all of this, but basically, we're thinking about some scope, what we're trying to do in the organization, which area. And then we identify what we know about the company, like the macro structure. And we then have event storming sessions to zoom into certain areas, map it out in more detail. And that's why we've got these candidate boundaries. And then we can move on to validating them with Team Topologies and specifically Independent Service Heuristics. And following on from that, then we can decide, do we want to transition to these or maybe not yet? Or which of these opportunities do we want to focus on now? So trying to apply this in an iterative way is what I'm basically saying. I'm not saying, find all the boundaries, validate all the boundaries, and then do a big reorg. It's an iterative process. So let's talk about the company and the situation they were in. They're a market leader in one vertical. They've been established for 10 years. And the growth opportunities there are a couple of percent each year. There's no big future opportunities. They recently moved into another vertical. I think that we talked about modest growth opportunities. So significant revenue, but it's not going to totally grow the company in a huge way. That was where vertical C came into it. They wanted to move into an adjacent market with a product which is more it's more customizable, has more customization aspects to it, so it's a bit harder to take it online and make it more automated. But they were very clear that if we do this well, we know that there's a huge market for this product in the current form that could grow the company by 3 to 5x. So that was a situation we were in. And if you think about this on a Wardley map, the current vertical is almost a commodity, little differentiation opportunity. Vertical B, bit more to the middle, bit more differentiation opportunity there. But it was really vertical C all the way over there. If we can solve this hard problem and we can nail it, huge opportunities, and it's a long-term thing, 5, 10, maybe even beyond that, an opportunity that will be over that kind of period of time. And so that's when the question came up of, what can we reuse? What are we currently using in vertical A? Could it be reused for vertical B and C? Is that the right thing to do? That was the kind of questions they were having, and that was where we were helping to talk through some of those issues. So a couple of examples of the question here. The first one, from more of a domain perspective, would it make sense to have this horizontal platform which is shared by those verticals? Is there enough similarity, or do each of those verticals have very specific, unique needs, and it wouldn't make sense to have a horizontal here? The second question was, is it right for this company and the way they work? Can having that horizontal layer, collaborating with the verticals, can that work, or would it be more effective just to have 3 independent verticals? Even if it's viable from a domain perspective, maybe there are some organizational aspects that would make having that relationship not a good idea. And then third point here was, if we are going to grow as a company, if we are moving into 2 more verticals now and potentially more in the future, and we do need more horizontals and platforms, how can we start to learn from this experience and this opportunity and extract some playbooks and ideas about how to do that more often in the future? So phase 1, I don't like to use the word phase because it has some connotations. I'm sure people are tweeting stuff about waterfall and stuff and Project Management Institute stuff already. But just getting started, getting into the domain a bit first, looking at product vision board, having some remote sessions, sitting with the users, watching them do their work. This is how we started. And then we moved to ISH as the validation phase I was showing you earlier. So we get to the first couple on the brand and the sense check, and we felt, yeah, pretty clearly matches this. If this horizontal works for these 3 verticals, there is some generalization there. Could it even be a separate product? And they even talked about that. At the time, they were like, we want to keep this internal for now because we get an advantage. We don't want other people to use that. But in the future, as it moves across the Wardley map, maybe it would actually be a separate product. So, very, very clear yes on this one. We then get to revenue, customers, and personas. And I think also quite clear on this one too. If it was a separate product, it would be for, there were some B2B, their competitors would actually want to use this. This was one of their advantages in vertical A over the competitors. So their competitors would want this. But we did see some challenges around the user personas. We started seeing that actually in those different verticals, some of the users and their needs, there was, in some areas, the variation was quite high. And that's, is it generalizable or is it not? What would actually be in the platform and which bits would they have control over? And in one of the situations, a couple of the verticals wanted something, and one of the others wanted to control that themselves. So this one wasn't clear. So whenever we have a yellow post-it here, made in Miro, whenever we have one of those, that's a sign that we're not saying no, we're just saying we've got to do more discovery here. So you can see with the green post-its, that's telling us, yeah, we're okay on those things, and the yellow ones are showing us where we need to dig in deeper to answer this question in more detail. So the ISH is helping us to identify where we should focus to continue validating this opportunity. We then got to impact and value, and I think this was also a very clear yes. It's very complex. So anyone who comes to a domain-driven design conference would love to work in that area, trying to find out the generalizable, the specific aspects, And the impact was also obviously huge, supporting an existing market leader vertical and helping B and C get into the market faster and supporting their needs. So from the problem, the opportunity itself is interesting, and the value is very clear to the company. So a big yes on this one. Then we got to data, and we just felt like we can't answer all those questions confidently. We're not worried at this stage because we need to get more into the details here. We did see some issues with the verticals, and even though it was the same company, they were using some different systems, so we could see some integration challenges there. And if we asked a more general question, if this was a fully independent cloud service, then yeah, there probably would be some issues there if all their competitors use a different internal systems to connect things. So again, orange post-it, not too worried, need to do a bit more work. So far, everything's looking quite good. Then we got to teams and dependencies. So from a pure ISH perspective, as we went through these questions, we felt dependencies will be an issue. It's a horizontal supporting multiple verticals. It's always going to be some dependencies to think about there. It's not going to be purely straightforward. So from the pure perspective, everything looked fine, but then we started to think about, okay, now let's think about this particular company and how this would work here from a teams and dependencies perspective. As you can see, is it on here? So there are multiple legacy systems, and there were 3 engineers working in the team. So this is a good point to introduce Team Topologies and the concept of cognitive load and explain that, 3 engineers supporting 3 verticals, and they've got 3 existing legacy systems. That's the cognitive load of like 20 people. So what this is telling us is investment is needed there. Maybe this horizontal is actually multiple teams. There's also a legacy aspect, but also the future-looking aspect. So cognitive load's quite high here, and we didn't feel comfortable to say, yeah, this is fine, don't worry, we'll just do a bit more DDD and then it will all be fine. Like, this was a big problem, actually, a real big problem. So at this point, we're like, no, unless this changes, it's not a good idea. And then finally, we got to cost tracking and product decisions. From a general perspective, again, we felt like this would work as an independent cloud service. No major problems here. But then we started to become more specific and asking these questions about the company itself, and we uncovered some issues with the funding model. So basically, the current team that owns what would become the horizontal. So firstly, they were getting requests from 50 stakeholders. I should have said that on the last slide, so that was already the dependencies issue. But in this particular example, what we learned is that the horizontal team has no budget, but it's not magic. Basically, the vertical teams are funding them. So the vertical team asks for something. Yeah, if you build it, we'll pay for it, but we're not paying for you to go to a DDD conference as well. You're not getting any training budget out of this. You're not getting any refactoring budget. You build only what we ask for. And so now we're seeing that they don't own that product roadmap. And actually, they wanted to own that product roadmap. They wanted the time to think about when we solve a problem, we want to solve it in a way that when we need time to talk to all the verticals, figure out what one vertical needs and what the others might need in the future. We're not talking like a 5-year roadmap, but if we build something now, just get some sense of what's coming next beyond that. But they had no roadmap autonomy. And I think, again, we go back to Team Topologies here, and autonomy is an important aspect of that, teams having control of their roadmap. And so from my perspective, this was a definite no. And we said, yeah, this has to change. So the outcome was, these changes have to be made before you move to the vertical if you want to be successful. I've got a couple of quotes for you. This one's actually really interesting. What does independent enough mean? How do you decide if 2 things are too coupled or not coupled enough? That's one of the very first things in the ISH. And I was with a group, and one of the developers was saying, yeah, what is independent? Because you can't have everything totally independent. What is independent enough? That was a great conversation. Maybe that can be the next keynote at Domain-Driven Design Europe. Like, what is independent enough? Maybe. Yeah, and this developer, so he was interested in architecture, and we're talking about stuff like funding models, and it's like never thought about all this stuff before, but actually it's kind of relevant to architecture. So going through the heuristics help people to see more of those organizational and business aspects and how that relates to architecture, and how something like your funding model can completely compromise your architecture. Matthew.
Thank you, Nick. So Nick and I and my team were working together with this same customer in North America. And so this is my perspective on the same engagement. What we found is that the executives were kind of on board. So the CEO had read the Team Topologies book and was like, yeah, this is great, let's do it. But we found that there was a level of kind of, that their expectations were unrealistic, effectively.
Be careful, Matthew.
No.
Be careful.
Expectations were unrealistic. So there was one of the execs said something like, when I was building e-commerce sites 20 years ago, it was much quicker and simpler. The engineers obsess over details and this kind of thing. Well, 20 years ago, we didn't have a whole lot of security challenges. The technology was a lot simpler, all sorts of things. We had this sense of, why is it so slow? And there was even a sense in which just trying to find the team boundaries and system boundaries should just take like a few days in a big system like this, and that should be enough. And so that was quite an interesting point to get to right in the middle of an engagement, to realize that the exec expectation was, it's just a few days and we'll be done. And this is part of the reason why we introduced independent service heuristics at that point. We expanded the use of it. We expanded the use of this technique to try and facilitate some conversations in a semi-structured way. And one of the things we did is to use a kind of visual heat map like this on the screen here. So you don't need to worry about the details, but effectively we've got, on going vertically, we've got a lot of candidate services or candidate streams, things that might be separate. And then across the grid from left to right, we've got the 10 heuristics from ISH. And then we got people together and explained it, ran through it. We did a bit of discovery first on some possible separate streams. And then we had spent some time asking people to think through from their experience, for a given candidate stream, is the data well-defined? Could you imagine it being run as a cloud service? And so on. Run through each of those 10 heuristics. And what you end up with is a kind of heat map of sort of viability or perceptions of viability for this candidate stream. And you can have many different voices, many different perspectives on the same grid. And you can immediately see the areas which are more viable. So there's something down towards the bottom where almost everything is green. There's something towards the middle where there's lots of red. And so immediately you can see the areas that are likely to be quite fruitful, and perhaps we move ahead with investigating those more immediately. But then the areas that are red, we go, well, this looks like there's a difference of opinion. Are we talking about the same thing? Maybe the terminology in people's heads is different. What is this telling us? It's a really useful, quick way to facilitate conversation about boundaries, about system viability, and this kind of thing. A couple of quotes from one particular person involved, who's actually the head of strategy, so he was at the exec level. I really like using the independent service heuristics as a rule of thumb for where we draw high-level boundaries within the organization. So he really kind of got it, if you like, really sort of seemed to understand what was going on. And he was saying, this is how we can build teams that are as independent as possible while maintaining laser-like focus on outcomes. It's quite interesting to see that perspective. He's thinking about business viability, he's thinking about the future, he's thinking about funding, all kind of stuff. He was actively involved in these sessions and saw the value. And part of our work there was to help this organization understand the technique well enough to be able to use it themselves on an ongoing basis. So yeah, we use the independent service heuristics to help people realize what is involved in finding good boundaries for fast flow. It's not just a couple of days. It's actually quite involved, as you all know.
A week.
Yeah. I'll just go through another case study. So this is a separate thing. The second case study here with the large retailer in Southeast Asia. This happened, did this work in nearly a year ago now. Last August 2021. And they are busy differentiating their offerings via digital services. When we ran a version of the independent service heuristic session with them, we actually had a really wide spread of different roles attending. So some ones that are fairly obvious, I guess, like engineering director and engineers, head of SRE for reliability, product directors, the CTO was there. But we also had product directors for physical goods. In this case, it was clothing and accessories. And we also had the warehouse manager. So literally the person who is responsible for the physical warehouse, for shipping the goods, was also involved in the session. So this goes well outside of digital, well outside of software. This is for real physical products that this retailer was involved in. And all of these roles were able to contribute really well. All these roles here all understood what was going on and could contribute hugely and found the language and terminology very accessible. So independent service heuristics, in this case, bridged the physical and digital product needs because of the nature of the questions. We had things around checkout flow, high net worth customers, order picking, returning goods, shipping and fulfillment, warehouse management, whatever. Quite a wide range of different things. Some digital, some quite physical, some mix. But it seems to be able to bridge these maybe quite different worlds. Again, we use the heat map. This is a slightly earlier version of the independent service heuristics where we only had 7. This particular organization actually added 3 more. They sent some pull requests to GitHub, and we merged those in because it was really useful. They actually took the technique and expanded it massively within their organization. And they found it really useful. So the head of product in this particular organization said this: the framework and shared language of independent service heuristics was transformational to the discussions about our organization and team structure. So thanks to Team Topologies and ISH framework, our team structure is more autonomous, meaningful, and productive. So it really helped them. It really helped them. And it helped them in part because it's a format which is very useful. It lends itself very well for discussions across lots of different roles. And it's something which they can take away and run without expensive external consultants. And we've found this time and time again, really, over the last year, particularly over the last year, as we've run it more frequently. Business and product people often have a kind of intuitive light bulb moment with ISH and become quite enthusiastic, which is great to see. OK, so we've got a few takeaway points.
All right, first takeaway point is none of the remaining slides were made in Miro. I'm sorry. Firstly, it's rapid and low fidelity. So it's not something we're saying that you can just do this one thing and you'll figure everything out. Something you can do quickly to test an idea, in my example, to go through those heuristics, or as in Matthew's example, creating the heat map and doing that up front to find the opportunities. And in that respect, it's not competing with any of your existing techniques. I would say it's supplementary. You can use it in addition to other domain-driven design stuff. I guess part of that reason is, as I was talking about earlier, as we went through ISH in particular, we got to those funding model issues and team ownership issues. So it brought things up, raised conversations and topics that the other techniques didn't bring up, or didn't bring up in the same way. One of the observations I also found is that after talking about ISH heuristics and after Matthew's large-scale workshop, we saw people talking about these in general meetings on a day-to-day basis. So they did start to become ingrained. These heuristics that are relevant to design of teams and architecture, people were incorporating them into how they think. It was, as we talked about earlier, we want people to be able to do design for themselves all through the organization, yeah, we did see signs that was happening. And then the terminology issue, again, I would say this applies probably more to the workshops you did with the large groups and the heat map. I was in those sessions, and yeah, we didn't spend much time talking about terminology up front. Not saying any of the terminology isn't useful, we're just saying to get started, to engage a diverse group, a technique like this is useful because there's no upfront learning needed, really. And in fact, I was pretty skeptical of the approach Matthew went with when he started with the ISH and creating the heat map. I'm like, you know, where did the ideas come from? You surely need to do event storming first. You have to do event storming before everything in domain-driven design. But I was surprised, actually, it wasn't the case. Because when we frame ISH as a way for people to come together and to talk about these topics, and we're not super focused on having high confidence boundaries as the output, yeah, it totally works for that purpose. It gets them excited about design. And that made it easier to actually start talking about DDD afterwards and how DDD can help with some of the issues like dependencies that were coming up in those workshops.
So it seems like, again, reverse engineering, with our experience of the last few years, Independent Service Heuristics is kind of increasing practitioner and manager level awareness of this kind of service-oriented or providing a service idea, basically focusing on the business reasons for a change, rather than kind of obsessing about, oh, we've got this IT system over here, so we can make a change to that because it's easy to deploy, or something like this. So really more getting people to focus on the business viability, like we said before, rather than the technology or something else. And particularly when we're running sessions where we've got all people together, we have that kind of shared experience of all doing this stuff together. And that can be a really important kind of change event as the organization is evolving towards something more effective for the modern context. So like I said, we've got business and product people often having a kind of light bulb moment and becoming quite enthusiastic, which is a great thing to have. So having business and product people enthusiastic in a session that's run by techies is a good thing in my book. So this feels quite a productive approach. So ISH is Independent Service Heuristics are addressing many different dimensions for flow-friendly boundaries. It's viability, kind of coupling and decoupling, existing cloud or SaaS products. Is it outsourceable? Does it start to talk about micro enterprises like hire use and so on? If you want to try these, head online, teamtopologies.com/ISH. You'll find an article and you'll find a link to the GitHub repository from that place there. And it's all, just feel free to use and adapt and send us pull requests and share what you're doing. If it's useful, share what you're doing. If it's not useful, this is a technique that we found useful, and hopefully you might find it useful too.
And Matthew, it works in Miro, right? Your workshop was in Miro. Yeah, it's in Miro. Works in Miro?
Yes, it works in Miro too. So thank you all. And I think, let's say we've got time for 5 minutes for questions, and then maybe break early for lunch. How does that sound? Thumbs up for break early for lunch? Okay, good. Okay, so
do we have any questions first? Let's not be too presumptuous.
We have 5 minutes for questions if you want to ask questions. Just a second, we've got a mic here as well.
For the recording.
So you said you didn't do any event storming up front. So how did you identify the candidate streams?
So this was Matthew. Do you want to take this, or?
Yeah, that is a good question. Thank you. This question is not planted. This is a really good question.
And that was my concern up front. I'm like, how can this work if you don't have anything existing to work with?
So actually, it was during the engagement that Nick and I were working on, where we had to pretty rapidly innovate around the technique for exactly this. We had some techniques before which kind of worked a bit all right. Anyway, what we ended up with is looking at using 3 perspectives to find candidate streams. And the first perspective is fracture planes from the Team Topologies book. So it's called a fracture plane because if you have a monolith of software, a big piece of rock, monolith literally means single stone in Greek. So you've got a big piece of rock. Some rock, if you hit it, it splits nice and cleanly. That's why it's called fracture plane. It's a bit, looking back, we could have found a better terminology. Anyway, whatever. So if you find nice places to split this big lump of stuff, and there's many, I can't remember how many fracture planes there are, about 8 or 9. The first one is DDD boundary context, but there's other things like risk and compliance and team location and blah, blah, blah. So you use these fracture planes to think about one way to split. We also use, the second perspective is user needs. So identify a different set of user needs, potentially different kind of users and their needs, and use that to split. And the third perspective is higher micro-enterprises. So which of these things could you run as a higher style micro-enterprise? And it's 3 different perspectives on the same kind of thing, but it leads to different discussions because different people identify better with one of these 3 different lenses, if you like. So that's how we came up with the initial kind of candidate streams. And we typically end up with, in a session like that, we typically end up with 20, 30, 40 different candidates for each of those 3 different lenses. So you end up with like hundreds of different potential independent services. We typically only take a few across in a session with a customer because otherwise it takes far too long. But you just keep repeating the process until we've identified some sensible.
You make the decision of the customer.
We make the decision, or the customer makes the decision about.
What is the candidate?
We decide. So the question was, do the consultants make a decision, or does the customer make a decision about which candidates to take across? We work on it together, and we get to the point where the customers say, actually, yeah, that's a nice one to try because it's quite typical, or it will probably feel like it'll answer lots of questions. We bring across some examples to try that people in the session feel like would be valuable to try at that point. Together, yeah. It's a great question, thank you.
I would just add one thing on to that. The group was quite diverse as well, like you mentioned. So, if you're working with a client and you've got your point of contact and a few people you talk to, certain areas might come up in those conversations, but when you get this diverse group, other things get brought up as well that maybe you haven't spoken about before that point.
For the retail example, did you identify a core domain for the company, and was it simple to have this discussion?
For the example where Nick and I work together, or for the Southeast Asia retailer?
Southeast Asian, the retailer, the physical and the warehouse. For their platform, did you have a discussion of the core domain? Was it a simple discussion? Did you discover a core domain?
Yeah, we did. It's a good question, so thank you. We did have some awareness about what they were doing, but some of that discovery, so we went into the ISH session itself with some awareness of that, with their operating context and so on, but some of the some awareness of their domains came out just by thinking about the different candidate streams. So that sort of happened kind of just in time as we were using things like independent service heuristics, as we were using fracture planes, for example, to try and find the candidate services. So it became the core operational or the core focus of the different parts of the business kind of emerged at that point. So it was quite late. But it happened just before we wanted to do the kind of assessment against the different dimensions.
Thank you.
Hey, don't you think that this could lead to a gap between the user needs and the actual business needs? So I'm thinking that this is puts the product owner in the focus, but not the user. Oh, how's your experience on that?
Could do. It could do. I mean, one of the lenses that we use, one of the perspectives we use when looking for the different candidates is user needs. So we're pretty close to the user there. But yes, there's an opportunity for using an additional, an extra lens to try and find these candidate streams. And there could be another technique that you use to do that. And then effectively you've got you're increasing the richness of perspective on finding those candidates, which is a good thing. And then we can take those candidates to the evolution. So if there's, that could be a nice suggestion for an enhancement to the way that they work. If there's a different lens or perspective to use to find those candidates, that would be great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. When you're talking about looking for SaaS solutions or micro businesses within, do you look at the user value or more the internal value? Thinking of the user gets some value out of it, but it might be that you have 3 smaller values combined gives us larger user value. So do you then split? Or how do you weight?
Yeah, good question. So one of the heuristics, heuristics, I think it's number 9, is around kind of scope and things, and some of the detail on that one is like, is this thing too small, effectively? And so effectively, is it the right size? Is it big enough to provide some sort of useful value independently? Or does it feel like effectively it's just a single feature or just a tiny little thing? And if it's too tiny, it's too small. It's not worth aligning kind of teams and so on around that. But yeah, I mean, the thing about ISH is it's not comprehensive. It's pretty rapid. It's kind of low fidelity. It gets the conversation started, and we definitely would typically want to use some additional refinement techniques to go further and to explore things in different ways.
I think we did get, I think there were in a couple of your workshops some conversations around that, about what actually would be small enough and what actually is the different types of persona. Those conversations did come up. They weren't answers, but those are the kind of conversations that happened.
Yeah, and those conversations are great because there's no point aligning a team to something super, super small, which is really boring, effectively. We want to find something that's actually compelling enough for a team to work on. Otherwise, they'll resign, and then we won't have a team anymore. So there's some very practical things here. Again, it feels like viability. We're thinking about viability. Is this thing viable is it too big, or is it way, way, way too small? Somewhere in the middle is about right. I think it's probably time for lunch. So thank you for all the questions, everyone.